Hello, YouTube. Today I will look at my notes about a very interesting subject, and I think you will find it interesting too. But let me start here. There was a poem discovered in a manuscript from the 11th century, but scientists believe that it has an older origin. For a swarm of bees was one of the early examples of a specific category of poetic spells known as bee charms. European beekeepers used these spells to control the behavior of their bees. The spell prescribed reading magic words and throwing a handful of earth into a swarm of bees. This gesture was important as the ground, that part of the earth, could confuse insects and make them land. The text of the spell also referred to bees as valkyries, seeing the work of bees as warriors and their stings as a kind of swords. Many examples of bee charms have come down to our days from the Middle Ages, but they were popular until the 19th century when progress in beekeeping technologies supplanted so-called magic. Modern researchers believe that scientific and cultural changes have helped to open up a new approach to bees and understand their behavior. Today we know that bees function as a collective superorganism, and the swarm is a way of reproduction. When one hive overflows, the queen and her entourage leave the swarm in search of a new home. Modern beekeepers carefully monitor their colonies and provide them with everything they need, including free hives for new swarms. But you see, in the Middle Ages, beekeepers used other methods. They kept bees in a wicker or straw baskets that were small enough to motivate colonies to split into multiple hives. Every summer, beekeepers killed part of the colonies to collect honey, but left the rest for overwintering and replenishing the population. Moving colonies to new baskets required the use of bee charms. Although there are more than 20,000 species of bees, only representatives of the genus of honeybees, I think there are 11 known species today, produce honey. Perhaps it is to them and also to the ancient Scandinavian ritual that we owe the term honeymoon. The syrupy sweetener was part of the very first known, basically alcoholic beverages, including mead, a fermented honey drink. Mead is known in many parts of the world, and it's not just something that the Vikings concocted. We do know where exactly mead originates from, but there has been found archaeological evidence from Asia and also from other parts of Europe. Mead can be traced back more than 10,000 years, so it has been popular for a very long time, even though it has not received the proper attention in many years. Mead, in Old English, I believe it's meodu. In Old Norse, it was mjod. In Danish, mjad. It's an alcoholic beverage made by fermenting honey, water, and yeast. And if you want more flavors, you can just add different herbs, fruits, grains, or spices. So you can make it to your own liking. Mead, or by the way in Russian, Mead, typically has an alcohol percentage between 8 to 20%. So like beer, like wine, you can get a mild or a strong bottle of mead. But mead is not really sweet. It doesn't have to be. And nor does it always have a very strong taste of honey. Mead can be everything in between, from very dry to very sweet. And the drier the mead is, the less it tastes of honey, people say, and the sweetness of the mead is also reduced. Various flavors are often added to the mead, and the flavors that the Vikings could add to the mead depended a lot on what would be growing in the local area. Because the landscape varies a lot in Scandinavia, and it did so much more 1,000 years ago. So you had various choices of what to add. Mead can be brewed the whole year, so the flavors can really change a lot depending on the season and which herbs and fruits were available. The time it took to brew mead also depended on which ingredients were being used, and mead could be made in as little as a month if you are in a hurry, but it could take a year or even longer. So mead was an important attribute of Scandinavian marriage ceremonies. Going back to the 5th century, our era, it is believed that the newlyweds had a tradition to drink as much honey as possible during the first full moon or month of marriage. This tradition is one of several possible variations on the appearance of the term honeymoon. And the name of this custom, honeymoon, has ancient roots, and it wasn't always about taking a vacation. Since honey was thought to be an aphrodisiac and enhance fertility, a month's supply of mead, in other words, 1 moon's worth of honey, was given to newlyweds. This tradition may have originated in Europe, like I said, as early as the 5th century of Common Era, but acquired its current meaning as a post-nuptial getaway in the 19th century. So mead, also known as honey wine, it inspired the creation of similar drinks. Braggot, made from honey and malt, and I believe people characterize it as a cross between mead and beer. Very interesting stories surround mead through the ages. People have been drinking mead for a very long time, and some say that the beverage might have been the result of very lucky accident in which rainwater dripped into a pot of honey. Some early records provide clues that a fermented honey drink was enjoyed in India 4,000 years ago, and there is also evidence of a beverage of honey, fruit, and rice originating in China 7 millennium before Common Era. By the way, about India, the first mention in ancient Indian collection of Vedic Sanskrit hymns, the Rig Veda, was written about 3,700 years ago. That's the earliest we know, but it might have been well before that. The ancient Greeks called mead the nectar of the gods, since honey has antioxidant and antimicrobial properties. Some have deemed mead to be a drink that's not only delicious but also so good for human beings. Then there is Beowulf. It's an old heroic poem written sometime before the Norman conquest of England. It's a story of a Scandinavian prince who fights against the monster Grendel. That monster was attacking the Heorot Mead Hall belonging to Hrothgar, king of the Danes. Beowulf slays Grendel in a swamp close to Heorot, and Hrothgar hosts a mead-soaked celebration of the hero's victory. And then Grendel's mother comes to avenge her son's death, and Beowulf again has to become a hero and do his deeds. The Vikings apparently loved alcoholic drinks, and not only did they brew their own Viking mead, beer and ale, but they also imported wine, if this word can be used. I think they got wine some other ways, from areas such as ancient France. Mead was not cheap to brew, and it was certainly not an everyday occurrence for the Vikings, unless they could afford it. Mead was most likely only for the special occasions, for feasts, for rituals, for celebrations of the victories. Vikings, they drank mead at seasonal feasts and other ceremonies that celebrated life's important events. The king would be served first, followed by others according to their social rank. The Norse, the people of the North sometimes had a very raucous reputation, but if they did get drunk quickly on mead, that may be due to what they used to drink the mead. A drinking horn, which could not easily be put down, therefore encouraging faster consumption. I've seen this in the country of Georgia. At that time, it was part of the Soviet Union. Over 50 years ago, how people consume wine from those horns. Very interesting spectacle. Mead is the oldest alcoholic beverage in the world, some people say, and its popularity has been steadily increasing in recent years. And, like I said, that's what the Vikings liked the most, and they had entire buildings dedicated to it, known as mead halls. For monasteries in England and Wales, and I'm sure surrounding countries, mead was a product of beekeeping. It also made candles with beeswax. But then came the time when these monasteries were being destroyed. Between 1536 and 1540, and I talked about this in some of my other videos. It was during the political development called the Reformation under Tudor monarch Henry VIII. But there was a period when the mead-making tradition began in in the monasteries in 643 Common Era and continued. There was an island of Lindisfarne, I believe, where visitors to the island even today can sample mead made with local honey and water drawn from the hills, nearby hills. Reportedly, Queen Elizabeth I had her very own recipe for mead, a concoction that would likely seem too sweet to modern consumers of mead or other alcoholic beverages. But apparently, mead was not just for the enjoyment of the aristocracy and the royal families. And you can read about this in Geoffrey Chaucer's story collection, The Canterbury Tales, especially in the Miller's Tale, where mead was used to basically to woo a woman and to seduce her. And Chaucer described a young wife with a mouth that was as sweet as a braggot or as mead. Very interesting tales, very unusual, but it's up to you to read them. But now I need to go to the land where I was born and nearby surrounding countries. Medovukha is a Slavic honey-based alcoholic beverage. It's one of the most recent and perhaps best known repetitions of a long evolutionary tree of Russian, and not only Russian, but East European honey-based beverages that can be traced all the way back to the old Slavs. In Russia today, some argue that a return to these honey drinks, which are traditionally not really alcoholic, or just slightly alcoholic, somewhat like beer. It should be seen not only as part of a wider cultural revival, but also return to healthier lifestyle that existed before the advent of vodka. Fermented honey drinks were once used primarily for rituals, weddings, and festivals, just like the Vikings. At the beginning of a feast, an offering of medovukha was often made to the gods. In many places, both within Russia and outside of Russia, honey and honey beverages were heavily associated with fertility, health, and vitality. Some regions even believed nutritious honey had magical powers of resurrection. The beverage was also given at weddings with often a month store of honey or a honey drink for the bride and groom to keep them healthy and help them conceive. This tradition, which became common in many cultures, led to the term honeymoon. In Russian, we simply say honey month, медовый месяц. Fermented honey was also often drunk at funerals as a way to affirm life while mourning the dead. Some medovukha advocates also claim that it is good to drink to cure or prevent colds. Medovukha is also considered traditional in many diverse Slavic cultures and can be found today if you go to supermarkets or bars. Belarus, Poland, Russia, Ukraine. Honey has natural antibiotic properties, thus getting it to ferment is not a quick or easy process. Early recipes for aged honey called for 2 parts honey and 1 part berry juice. Other additives could include herbs, pollen, and or nectar, which affected the taste and what were believed to be mystical properties of the drink. The berries added moisture and wild bacteria and yeasts, which allowed fermentation to start. Barrels filled with the mixture were often sealed with resin and buried for could be for 2 decades, generally resulting in the alcohol content of about, I would say, from 10 to 16%. Given the difficult production of the beverage, it was a high-value drink. I want to add that if you add bay leaves and pepper, that gives it special taste. I don't remember everything that was added. This goes back decades, but it's an interesting spectacle to see how people make medovukha. In its past, as medovukha was able to be produced more quickly and cheaply, it grew in popularity and was available to a much broader audience. But medovukha fell out of favor, at least in part due to the government policies. In the 16th century, Russian Prince Vasily III of Moscow prohibited private production of medovukha and declared that it could only be produced by the church and the state. So it then became a revenue source for these 2 institutions. See, as always, when the government takes away from a human being, when the government starts controlling more and more, normal people lose. And then during the 18th century, Peter the Great found that vodka could be quickly fermented to very high alcohol levels using much cheaper ingredients. So he nationalized vodka production as well as encouraged its production over medovukha because it could be taxed at higher rates. So medovukha, which had been considered Russia's national brew before that, was largely wiped out by the end of Peter the Great's reign. And this adds to the hypothesis that Peter the Great was basically a foreign agent, somebody who replaced the real Peter, who went to study in Europe, had fun, had girlfriends, studied navigation and other things, but apparently was snatched by foreign agents, should we say Great Britain, and a foreigner who did not speak like him, did not look like him, took his place and therefore ruled Russia. But I am not as conspiratorial as that, and I think the real Peter the Great, the emperor, whoever was in charge of Russia, knew how to make money. In the early years of the communist rule, when they usurped control of the former Russian Empire, there was a very interesting revival of medovukha because the Soviets encouraged moving back to historically significant cultural traditions where it suited them, and found that they had a surplus of honey in those early years. However, medovukha was soon overtaken by vodka again as an important source of tax revenue, and honey production was not prioritized as it was before. From the 1990s, there has been a growing culinary trend in the Russian Federation to go back to local ingredients and all their traditions. So the honey production has also increased, and some regions, such as Suzdal, it became particularly known for the medovukha production in these times. Now, let's talk about the unusual behavior of bees in the apiary, about the rebellious bees. This is from my notes too. And I will read it directly. It's a very interesting story. So here's what the narrator talked about. There was an incident at our apiary a few years ago that I can't forget to this day. On a day off in a good sunny weather at 10 o'clock in the morning, we began to inspect the bees with my father. Everything was as usual, but gradually we began to feel some tension. It began to seem to us that an attack had begun on the family we were examining. Every minute there were more and more bees near the summer house. We quickly closed the hive, threw a bag over it, and sprayed it with kerosene from all sides. When we looked at other hives, we saw that the same pattern began to repeat there. That is, all other 10 families were attacked. We were confused. Meanwhile, the cloud of bees in the air was increasing, and not dozens, but thousands of bees were circling near each hive. Literally, in a matter of minutes, all the bees of the apiary rose into the air. We looked into one hive and found that there were practically no flying bees in it. The bees scattered about 100 meters in diameter. We felt uneasy. A huge black cloud of bees was flying in the air. They became aggressive, climbed into all the cracks. My father and I put on canvas trousers, boots, gloves, jackets, beekeeping nets, and tied the sleeves with twine. Our dogs climbed into their kennels. We covered the entrances to them with bags, as bees were getting there too. From our house to the road that led to the taiga was about 30 meters. We took it. A cyclist was riding along it. We didn't have time to shout to him to go back as he stopped, waved his hands, turned around sharply, and began to run away with great speed. As luck would have it, a truck appeared after him, in the back of which people were sitting. In front of our house, passengers began waving hands and shouting. The driver braked sharply, opened the cab door, but immediately waved his hands, closed the door, jerked the car sharply, and regardless of the bombs, began to move away at high speed. At that moment, our 3-month-old calf, who was grazing near the apiary, rushed as fast as he could without reaching the gate, fell, and bees swirled over him. We threw a blanket over him and dragged him into the barn. While all this was happening, there was there were noticeably fewer bees circling in the air, and gradually the bees began to return to their hives in the apiary. All this commotion lasted 30 to 35 minutes. Then everything calmed down and we continued the inspection. That night, around 11 o'clock, I suddenly felt that someone was rolling me from one side to the other and back. It lasted 2 or 3 seconds. I quickly got down from the attic where I usually sleep in the summer and ran to the house. My mother was standing in the middle of the room and crossing herself, and my father was fast asleep. She said she was rolling around on the bed too. Then we decided it was an earthquake. We've never felt anything like this before. Indeed, the next day it was broadcast on the radio that an earthquake had occurred in the Primorsky territory, Maritime province, the day before. I remembered about the rebellious bees and realized that they flew out of the hives, anticipating it. The person who narrated this, who wrote this down, his name was Golokhvastov, last name, I don't know his first name, just initials VA, and he is from the Primorsky Krai. There were interesting comments, for example, from Alexei. We also had this, but we live where there are no earthquakes. We also could not understand why there was such a riot. Another comment is this. Yes, it was like this 2 years ago in the Kemerovo region in August. In the evening, the bees were exhausted in the morning. I woke up from the buzzing of the bee. The air was shaking from the clouds of bees darting in different directions. I grabbed the broom. There was a whole bucket of infusion of spruce branches and finished spraying them. After half an hour, everything calmed down. That I still do not have the clear answer as to what happened in the apiaries. Back in the waning days of the Soviet Union, there was a very interesting article. And part of it goes like this. At the first all-union, meaning from all over USSR, seminar, Biological Aspects of Earthquakes Forecasting, the honeybee was also mentioned as a possible harbinger of earthquakes. So in the report of a researcher at the Institute of Seismology of the Academy of Sciences of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, devoted to the study of ways to predict strong earthquakes by the behavior of animals at the Kazakhstan prognostic range, it was reported that before the earthquakes, earlier than others, for 2 weeks, along with the snakes, bees behaved unusually. When interviewing local residents in the zone of the Zaysan earthquake that occurred on June 14, 1990, one of the beekeepers observed a strong swarm of bees 12 days before this event. Despite the measures taken, 2 swarms out of 14 flew away. 2 days before the earthquake, the beekeeper noticed that the bees had stopped collecting food. In another case, beekeepers of Armenia before the earthquake observed an incredible phenomenon in their apiaries. All the bees flew out of the hives, mixed into one mass, and circled aimlessly in the air, buzzing violently. The strange behavior of bees foreshadowed a catastrophe, the earthquake that occurred on December 7, 1988. With the widespread occupation of the population by beekeeping, the lack of information about the behavior of bee families before earthquakes is unacceptable. In earthquake-prone areas, mass observations of bee behavior are needed. So in addition to the honeybee, it is advisable to observe the behavior of wild bees. They are more dependent on environmental factors, more sensitive to them. The inclusion of wild bees in the number of observed objects is necessary, since there are many nesting in the soil and mud-bringing buildings, among both solitary and social ones. This makes the study of their behavior as harbingers of earthquakes especially important and more reliable. Most people know bees for two reasons: for delicious honey and painful bites. But there is much more to tell about these insects. For example, that honey bees live in highly structured social groups where each bee plays a certain role. That some bees live alone and can chew holes in a tree. Did you know that? That they can be blue, white, or green in color. And there are more than 20,000 species of bees all over the world, according to this report. And more importantly for us humans, bees are crucial to the life of our planet. As pollinators, they're responsible for about a third of the food that we eat. Nevertheless, bee populations around the world continue to decline. And, according to this report, all this is due to climate change. Carbon dioxide emissions lead to extreme temperatures that cause habitat loss and increase in the number of parasitic mites and predators that, unlike bees, thrive in new climatic conditions, as well as an increase in the use of pesticides to control these new pests. All these factors affect bees both on a large scale, reaching the destruction of colonies, and on a small scale, when the changeable winds reduces the effectiveness of insects. Humans have a special attitude toward bees. Having appreciated them in ancient times for honey and wax, humans gradually brought bees closer to their homes, increasing the volume and range of services charged from them. To the expanded register of direct material tribute, propolis, pollen, bee venom, royal jelly, so-called public works were added, pollination of plants that were seeded by men, but not all of them were willingly performed by bees. Honey-bearing crops, buckwheat, sunflower, sweet clover, garden and berry plantations themselves imperiously attracted bees to themselves, and things got along. Mastering the world of bees, trying to control their lives, a person reads this unusual book of nature, so to say, for himself. Researchers were struck by the language of these insects, their ability to ensure the sterility of their home and bee products stored in it, effectively resist heat and cold, various diseases and pests, and other hardships that the environment sends to any living being. Bees have succeeded in more. They have created their own very finely regulated habitat and maintain it with extraordinary reliability and stability. A person, human being, communicating with honeybees, consuming their products, reveal the special benefit of these relationships for their health. Not only the substances and products extracted from the nest, honey, parchment, propolis, not only larval milk and moderate stings of protective bees, stimulating immune reactions of the body, had a healing effect. Constant participation in the life of new beings where they settled, contemplation of their work had a calming effect on human psyche, gave him cheerfulness, tuned him or her to the natural rhythms of life, and beekeepers, perhaps more than representatives of other professions, have established the reputation of people who are less ill and are more balanced, prone to acute observation. The fact is that a human being caring for a bee family involuntarily shares its worries and joys. A family of bees lives in a tense and changeable life with their moods. When the weather is favorable for plants and their flowers are full of nectar and pollen, the family is complacent and peaceful, but it will immediately become irritated and aggressive if the nectar in the field is scarce and the hive requires immediate replenishment. Then it is better for the beekeeper and his relatives, as well as pets, to stay away from the apiary. The explosiveness and emotionality of the bee family, the changes in the mood, the numerous, sometimes complex and contradictory vicissitudes of its life are fascinating, fertile material for any narrative about these insects. But it's not just about the scenic nature of the material. A rare topic, as it seems, so clearly beckons the reader with its desired breadth of rewards to those who intend to pass the basics of beekeeping art faster, getting free access to honey, propolis, and other substances and products from the treasury of the beehive. Rewards to the one who puts the joy of knowledge and communion with the mysteries of nature above all other benefits and values of life. She makes such a noise around us with her mystery and uniqueness, referring to a bee. And where else in other corners of it will you find this mystery and uniqueness more than in the community of hard-working insects? The honeybee, like its colleagues in the way of life, ants, termites, is a social being. Its life in some ways, even if only in some aspects, and to a distant extent, resembles our own. And people have noticed this connection since ancient times, this connection, found in the behavior of the bee traits worthy not only of attention, but also imitation, which could serve to evaluate their own actions and habits. Work like a bee, we hear from childhood and say it ourselves, setting her as an example of selfless care for her offspring, the good of her native home. The honey bee surprises a person with its fearlessness, willingness to sacrifice itself while protecting the nest. In her peaceful household cares, she is an unsurpassed master of wax constructions, the owner of recipes for the manufacture of food products that are not subject to spoilage, compositions of substances that effectively resist the attacks of harmful microorganisms. A family of bees shows the ability to influence the lifespan of their individuals, their physiological state, and social caste status. The products of the bee family are healing for humans and desirable. The promotion of its plants cultivated in the fields is very great. However, the role of a bee may well be fulfilled only with proper and timely care of it. After all, by changing the habitat, a human being has changed it for his honey companion, so to say. Having brought bees from the forests to the house and transplanted their nests into hives, human being created apiaries, likeness of his own villages. The self-made tablecloth which nature annually spreads out in front of honeybees has become different. Their new homes now surround the lands where man cultivated the plants that he needed. The flight of foraging bees supplying the hive with everything necessary is not very far, within 2 kilometers, so to say. So, having flown out of the apiary for prey, the bees, they encountered other plants. Which ones? It all depended on the will of the human being. If he preferred nectar-producing crops, the situation of the newcomers might even improve. In most cases, however, it has swung sharply for the worse. There were painful, non-biased periods, interruptions in the supply of pollen and nectar. Apiaries froze on such days, and families, if they revived, tried to redistribute the stocks made earlier among the stronger and more enterprising. Disadvantages in the habitat revealed unexpected properties of the bee itself, which people had not previously suspected. often setting it as an example of behavior. Many beekeepers, in order to restore peace, tranquility, and lost well-being in their apiaries, reached for cheap sugar, and the honey consumer, discovering these initiatives, immediately began to worry about the quality of the product they purchased. After all, flour, nectar, and syrup could be mixed at the will of the owners of apiaries in different, sometimes not easily determined, ratios which cannot be controlled by analysis. Really. Since you cannot build a business on sugar alone, beekeepers in search of lost nectar began to travel with their wards through the fields and forests, mountains and valleys, cultural lands and wild massifs, suffering themselves, disturbing and tying the captives of the nomadic hive. Beekeeping has become feverish. The fodder base, the basis of the existence of both a separate bee family and the entire industry, has lost the stability inherent in the natural cenosis. High honey collections have become interspersed with low or their complete absence. And here's the chemicalization of the agricultural sphere. The danger is of an extraordinary kind. The mass use of chemicals, which began in recent decades, has especially worsened the situation. Careless use of them threatened the direct death of flight foragers, while careful use carried another danger, the loss of the vegetation fields that previously supplied bees with pollen and nectar. There was no compensation for losses due to the seeding of special nectar-bearing crops, and the total nectar pollen resource of the agrocenosis decreased even more. Not only the nutrition of bees has deteriorated, but the populations of the entomophagous wild-living insects that regulate the number of direct pests of our crops have catastrophically decreased. The natural biological protection of the fields weakened, which led to the need for new massive chemical treatments. Gaps appeared in the delicate lace of connections between species, which preserve the balance of the environment, and man perceived the first formidable consequences of his previous and seemingly correct initiatives. Toxic substances began to accumulate in the environment, capable of accumulating the products we use for food. It has become bad for people, domestic and wild animals, and crops. The scale of damage to cultivated plants by toxins of pathogenic organisms has increased. And now, among the urgent measures to protect the biosphere from the imperfections of human activity, an unexpected demand for the return of the environment has emerged. The nectar. The reconstruction of the nectar-bearing landscape, which is already being carried out in a number of countries around the world, brings with it special hopes. It will not only increase the honey productivity of apiaries, but also improve the survival conditions of useful entomofauna, reduce chemical treatments, and in some places even abandon them altogether, make the surrounding area healthier and more attractive. It will allow countries like, for example, in Eastern Europe, as an example, not only there, to regain their former glories as the suppliers of bee products. The destruction caused by human activity in the natural sphere is serious and significant. Unfortunately, some of the previous trends have not been stopped even now. Not only modern generations are guilty of them, humanity has been professing the principles for centuries, following which it entered the period of current environmental disorders. how to see and understand their origins, how to raise the question of changing the very principles of survival. There's hardly any other way to understand them if you do not peer into the historical and geological milestones of our biosphere, into those lands and abodes where the threads of misconceptions and mistakes were conceived, and from where they were pulled into the future. You know, all this is true, and I am positive that with advent of at least some aspects of science, we can reverse it. But looking at the pollution and contamination of our planet, it's very hard to remain optimistic. I will never forget the beautiful panorama of biological civilizations that I read in the wonderful science fiction books of Soviet authors, Strugatsky brothers. But we live in another reality. Science fiction will not cut it. Let's look at more about the bees. Let's look at the distant past, and not only in the history of our relations with nature, including the honeybees, but also in the era preceding the appearance on Earth of flowering plants, insects pollinating them, and man himself. The era or epoch when there was a tremendous restructuring of the entire biosphere. There was a massive change of life forms, and more advanced and adapted species came on the scene. And yeah, they carried the victorious baton of time. They revealed wisdom of nature, and this could tell a lot to the human beings today. But how do you know? How can you read that message? How can you get that information? It's very scarce. Our distant past. The book of nature is open to everyone, but only to the extent of our own preparedness. Yes, science comes to the aid of the seeker and the inquisitive. If you believe in the omnipotence of science, omnipotence, it sharpens humans' gaze, gives human beings new points of support, allows human beings to overcome the barriers of ghostly time and intangible spaces. By establishing a connection with art, it draws from it its inherent sense of proportion, the ability to enjoy the harmony of the world and the struggle of its contradictory but mutually complementary principles. Only if demagogues do not control science, don't bring their idiotic, hysterical, new policies and perceptions into science. But this is happening, unfortunately. You can see it in the Western world, and not only Western world. Entering the world of the beautiful companion of our life, the honeybee, let's leave our excessive self-confidence at the entrance. Look into this world with hope and sensitive curiosity, willingness to be surprised, and try, as it should be, to be diligent and thoughtful students of nature, patiently nurturing us and doing our best not to destroy it. The youngest of the cohort of social insect species are honeybees. They are only, so to say, 25 to 40 million years old. But apparently bees are the brightest star among social insects. Their position in the world is especially secured, and this is due to the patronage of man, human being. The development of the biosphere with the appearance of man on the planet acquires fundamentally different features than before. By this time, the main stages of spontaneous evolution, if that's what you believe, are completed. Now, it will be increasingly meditated by human consciousness. Thus, development acquires the features not only of an evolutionary but also of an involutional process, since the human mind is able to move both along the forward and backward time scale. This allows us to turn to the very foundations of the universe to make its initial bricks, electrons, atoms, molecules work in our technology. This is the source of both inspiring and sometimes sad paradoxes of the modern world. With the establishment of human power, control on Earth, it is time for serious trials, basically for the rest of the inhabitants of the planet. The measure of all things, as the ancient philosophers used to say about human being, the extraordinary commissioner of the evolutionary and possibly involutional forces of the planet, he begins its gigantic inventory, a rare assessment of all its previously established hierarchies, in order with his needs and taste, assuming that we're dealing with advanced human beings, because not all of them are on this planet. Not all are looking forward into actually the next stage, as I talked about, becoming a galactical mankind. But the biosphere is rapidly being humanized. Fundamentally new features are emerging in it, in which Russian academician Vernadsky saw the image of the future noosphere, the sphere of reason. The living world of the planet is undergoing profound, sometimes tragic changes. The giant anthropogenic press, so to say, works non-stop, pushing hundreds and thousands of species through its spinners. At the same time, some get a chance to survive, others get a pardon due to uncompetitiveness, the entrance ticket to protective areas and reserves, but others are ordered to disappear altogether, and only a few species receive the status of the most favored and patronage. Among them is the honeybee. The man not only singled her out, but also brought her closer to his home, surrounded her with special care and attention. Having sacrificed their freedoms in the free forests, the bees found instead comfortable apartments, hives, and protection of the most powerful species on this planet. And other social insects have entered an alarming anthropogenic age with a solid margin of safety. Man began to take care of forest ants, seeing in their activities the benefit for the surrounding lands. The possessions of termites, other messengers of eternity, are so large and extensive that a person has to think more not about their protection, but about how to limit their further expansion. The exceptional resilience of the social species is an intriguing, fascinating mystery for the human mind, a kind of source of hope in overcoming the obstacles that arise in front of him in building the foundation of the noosphere of the future. Bees are highly efficient pollinators that are essential for plant diversity. When they are used to pollinate crops such as avocados, blueberries, and cucumbers, their yield and weight increase dramatically compared to crops grown using other pollinators. However, climate change may threaten our food systems. As weather conditions change, many animal species will strive for more ideal climatic conditions when their former habitats become less favorable. But experts fear that bees, unlike other insects, do not adapt to temperature changes, which can lead to a rapid decline in their population. In some regions, flowers are already beginning to bloom earlier, and it is unclear how bees will be able to adapt to these seasonal changes, and the reduction of their population can create big problems for both wild and agricultural crops. Like all insects, bees are cold-blooded, which means that their body temperature usually corresponds to the ambient temperature. But in the hive, where the developing brood lives, bees maintain a constant temperature of about 33 degrees Celsius all year round. Using their wings, they blow hot air out of the hive to cool the area, and to heat it, they vibrate their wings. As the changing climate leads to the emergence of new predators, some bee species have taken their thermoregulation abilities to a new level. Scientists have observed how Japanese bees pounce on invading Asian giant hornets, also known as killer hornets. Together they form a giant ball around the hornet and use the old methods of warming up the hive to cook the invader alive. Some bees have a remarkable ability to reverse aging. When the hive lacks a young workforce, older bees can return to their more energetic and younger selves to perform the necessary tasks. In fact, they live longer to make up for the lack of workers. That's what the billionaires from the Silicon Valley, who are running around crazy, afraid of becoming old, maybe that's what they should look at. I'm sure they are. This incredible phenomenon is constantly being actively investigated by scientists who want to better understand its basic mechanisms and determine the potential for their use to neutralize the effects of dementia. Criminologists have developed a statistical method called geographical profiling to study repeat crimes, serial murders, and burglaries. Based on the crime scenes, the police can make reasonable assumptions about where the suspect might live or which places he or she regularly visits. This is because, as a rule, repeat offenders try not to commit crimes in the immediate vicinity of their home, so as not to be caught. However, for convenience, they do not stray too far from their place of residence. It turned out that the feeding patterns of bees are quite similar. Insects avoid detection by predators and parasites, creating a distraction zone. They leave untouched the flowers closest to the entrance to the hive and feed a little further away. In the year 2008, a group of researchers observed bees visiting different flowers and tried to locate their hive using general practice methods. They found that the ways bees fed were just as reliable and predictable as the ways humans committed crime. Now criminologists can use information about bees to refine methods of geographical profiling. Although bees have a brain the size of a poppy seed, they are able to distinguish individual facial features of people and recognize them during repetitive interactions. In one study, scientists combined images of human faces with sweet water and found that bees recognize and remember faces associated with a sweet reward, even when there was no reward. The acute perception helps these social creatures not only recognize each other, but also recognize the flowers that produced more pollen and return to them. Let me tell you something I found also very interesting. It's about Tetragony carbonaria. And again, Australia brings strangeness out front. There are bees that build spiral hives and mummify enemies with bugs. Let me give you details. The irregularity of the Australian bees begins with the appearance. They do not have the usual black and yellow coloring. Instead, they're tinted from head to toe, so to say, in black. It looks brutal, but this external show-offs. In fact, Australian bees don't even have a sting. So their coloring is to scare off whoever is the enemy at the time. In theory, unarmed insects should regularly scavenge from aggressive Australian fauna. But the species is fine. Beehives can be found in any lowland forest in Australia. Their main weapon is effective interaction. As soon as the enemy approaches the hive, the insects form a battle swarm. They crowd around the nest, forming an angry cloud. This hint is more than enough for most enemies, but the small minority that tries to get to the entrance will face a new obstacle. The fact is that there is only one passage in the nest of this Carbonaria tetragonula. Its bees are tightly clogged with their own bodies, and there is no room for a predator there. Only a few are able to break through further, and this will be a fatal mistake. The intruder will be immured alive in the walls of the hive. This robber intruder who has penetrated into the nest is surrounded. He cannot defend himself effectively, which is what the tetragonules use. Insects cover the intruder with layers of resin, saliva, and wax until he turns into a pearl. When the unfortunate intruder stops moving, he is thrown out of the hive, and the residents continue to do their bee business. For example, building a house. It's crazy with them too. Convenient and practical hexagonal honeycomb tetragonules prefer round pouches that are arranged in a spiral. Outside, all this stuff is covered with propolis walls. They prevent insects from penetrating into the bowels of the hive, but shouldn't touch them either. A nest of bees, together with defensive structures, looks like an alien growth. The entrance to the nest is also a trick. It is covered with a vigorous mixture of resin and a bacterial solution of the bee production. When foragers return home, they stomp on the coating and disinfect the paws, so to say, which significantly reduces the chance of an epidemic or infection with fungi inside the colony. The inner space of the hive is patrolled by the queen personally. She oversees the work of young bees who take care of the next generation and gives cradles to hard workers who lay eggs. Insect society is designed so that an ordinary bee can lay an egg and a drone will hatch out of it. Only now the queen has no desire to feed the surplus of unemployed freeloaders. Australian bees work all year round, and they multiply too. To raise a queen, you need to treat her in a special way. The cell where the future princess will live is twice as large as the rest of the cells. The larva that was born is fed with royal jelly, which turns into a full-fledged female. Unlike the queens of ants and termites, a young queen bee is not able to raise a hive from scratch. After meeting, she says goodbye to her mother, takes some of her subjects, and flies away to build a new kingdom. People help the young queen with the latter, but not for free. Since the 1980s, Australians have been breeding tetragonules for honey. It is rumored that it has an unusual taste and aroma. So it turns out that the Australian bees even have their own honey. I don't know, I have listeners from Australia. They can tell me if this is so. I've had my own very interesting experiences with the bees, and this is something that maybe I'll talk about some other time. And killer bees, oh yeah, and wasps. I've had experiences with those, and I've seen what they can do to a human trapped in a car, for example. So that's what I wanted to let you know today. If we live on a very interesting planet, and there are creatures on it. Imagine extraterrestrial intelligence that takes the way of the bees or ants, for example. How you can communicate with it, and will it understand you to be a sentient being that is worth communicating? So that's what I wanted to let you know. If you like my research, please support it through the links you will find in the description to this video. Please tell others about my channel, and please like my videos. Thank you.